So I want to first of all say thank you so much to Dorie Clark for joining us. Dorie is just an absolute rock star, good friend, really, really good person. And, you know, welcome, obviously, Dorie, for joining us at Mays Business School, Texas A&M University. Before Dorie starts, I'd like to just give you guys an introduction to Dorie. Dorie is one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50. She was also honored as the #1 communications coach in the world by Marshall Goldsmith Coaching Awards. She's a keynote speaker and teaches for Duke University's Fuqua School of Business and Columbia Business School. In fact, that's how I actually met Dorie. The strategic partner of the university I was working at in Kazakhstan, the strategic partner was Fuqua. And the Fuqua faculty actually went over to Kazakhstan to teach in the executive MBA program there. So I was very fortunate to meet Dorie then. And she actually, if I remember correctly, you actually gave me your book, Reinventing You. So very cool. She's the author of Entrepreneurial You. That's been named one of Forbes' top 5 business books of the year. And also the book I just alluded to, Reinventing You, the #1 leadership book of the year by Inc. magazine. She's a former presidential campaign spokeswoman, and she's described by the New York Times as an expert at self-re-innovation and helping others make changes in their lives. And boy, does that resonate with us, Dorie Clark, because our actual sort of mantra is discover, impact, and transform. And if you look at our dean, Eli Jones, if you look at his LinkedIn profile, it actually says in the business of transforming lives. And that's really what we're real passionate about at Mays Business School. She's also a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review and consults and speaks for clients such as Google, Yale University, and the World Bank. Some cool facts, quick, about Dorie. She's a producer of a multiple Grammy-winning award jazz album. And she's also a Broadway investor. And she's joining us today from New York City. Dorie, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you here.
Well, thank you so much. Hey, Richard. Hey, Aggie friends. Really nice to have the opportunity to get to spend time with you. And I know it sounds like you guys have had a pretty intense week kicking things off. So congratulations on getting started in your program and getting started for the year. And also, I know that it's not just this week. You probably had about 4 months of being on Zoom calls. So I will do my best to try to keep it snappy for you. So I, just to get the ball rolling, just to get everybody on the same page, am going to do a screen share for a little bit and share a few kind of high-level concepts, ideas, talking about building your brand as a leader. And then, you know, when I'm done with that, I would love to open it up for your questions, your comments, your conversation, and hear what is on your mind as you are in week 1 of the program, which is pretty fantastic. So I am going to go ahead here and hopefully by now I have mastered all the Zoom basics. Let's see. I believe in theory that this should in fact be working correctly. Am I doing it, Richard? Is that looking good? Yes, thumbs up. Okay, fantastic. Thanks everybody. So, all right, let's dive in, right? As Richard said, I have spent the past decade plus basically really trying to think through the question of how do you build your brand as a leader? This is, I've written 3 books, and in many ways that is the sort of through line that undergirds all of them. And part of why I think that this is an important question, I mean, sometimes people think of personal brand as being this kind of frivolous topic, or like, oh, you know, why do I have to think about that? Or they people who don't like it think that it implies some kind of inauthenticity or creating a persona based on what you think that people will want or something like that. And that is actually really the furthest thing from what I'm talking about. At a very basic level, as a leader, I mean, you guys know this better than anyone, we are existing in a world right now where, first of all, most leadership has to be done through influence and persuasion. It's not to say that there aren't circumstances which are totally command and control. No, you must do this now. There's some, but there's a lot fewer than there were. And the truth is, even if that technically is the situation, people resent the fuck out of that. They don't like it. And so they are going to be bitter, and they're not going to perform well over the long term. They are going to, they might comply, but they will be looking to stab you in the back. And so ideally what we want is we want to create a situation where you are leading people who want to be led. And they will want to be led if they understand where you're going, if they're understanding what your mission is, and if you can bring them along so that they are on board. That is what makes people effective leaders over the long term. And so there's a lot of different facets to that, and we can go in lots of directions, but I wanted to share with you just a few thoughts, especially because you guys are, starting your MBA journey right now. And, you come from different backgrounds. Many of you probably have come out of the corporate world. Maybe you're taking a little time to do this. Maybe some of you are straight from undergrad, but you all have had jobs and experience in different ways, and you're probably all strategizing right now, enterprising souls that you are, about what is the internship you're going to have, how are you laying the groundwork for the future things that you want to do. And so I want to just share some thoughts and ideas about, as you are in that place of really thinking strategically, really laying the groundwork for getting the kind of jobs that you want, becoming the kind of leader and the kind of person that you want. How do we do that well? So there's 6 ideas that I wanted to share with you, and then we'll take on your thoughts, right? So the first one, I wanted to tell you a story. This is actually one from my book. I'll do a little prop because Richard mentioned it. This is the advantage of doing this at home. Here's Reinventing You. Here's my first book. And I profiled this woman. Her name is Joanne Chang. And I love Joanne's story. She went to Harvard. She was a math major, and like a good overachiever, she took a job at a consulting firm. And she did it for 2 years, and it turns out she hated it. She just absolutely hated it. And so when she was trying to figure out what she wanted to do, she searched her soul, and she realized she wanted to be a chef. Now, this was a while ago. This was like 20 years ago. And so at the time, it was super not cool to be a chef. Especially, she's got the typical parents that are just like, what are you thinking? You were making, 6 figures at this management consulting firm. Like, you want to be a chef? And it gets worse because she hadn't been to culinary school. She didn't have any qualifications in that way. She literally hadn't even worked in a restaurant, but she was like, I want to be a chef. And so you can probably imagine, this put her at a disadvantage. And so if she was going to get a job in a restaurant, if she was like doing the same thing as everybody else, if she was just sending in her resume or something, if you see an ad in the paper, proverbially, you see an ad online, whatever, you send in your resume, and you've got a person on this side that has like 10 years of experience working in restaurants. And then you've got Joanne who's like, hi, I was an economics major and I've never done this before. Who are you gonna hire? It does not look good for poor Joanne. But that is why I think this is a key lesson for all of us. She realized that she had to do something different than everybody else. Because the truth is, there is always going to be someone that has more experience than you. And if that is the only game that is being played, you will lose. And so she realized that she needed to play a different game. So what she did instead, she wasn't like waiting for job listings to come out and then like, oh, please pick me. She wrote proactive letters to a dozen chefs in Boston, which is where she was living. And she explained why she admired them, what she hoped to learn from them. And she said, if you have a job available, literally any job, I don't care, I'll do anything, I would love to be considered. And it was just so different. It was such a different letter. Frankly, it was a very humble letter that the next day, it turned out there was a famous chef in Boston at the time named Lydia Shire. And Lydia Shire's prep cook quit. And a prep cook, this is super not glamorous, they are the people who wash the vegetables and chop the vegetables. That is their job. But she said, you know what? Okay, if she's serious, let's give her a try. So for the next year and a half, Joanne, this, magna cum laude economics major, she was a prep cook. And the amazing thing, she put in the time and she learned what she needed to learn. She ended up working in the restaurant industry for 8 years, working for other people. But by the end of that 8 years, she knew what she was doing. And she opened her first bakery, and it was immediately a success. And over time, she has now expanded her empire. She owns 4 bakeries. She owns a restaurant, and she's published 2 cookbooks. She's even won a regional James Beard Award, which is the most prestigious award in the food world. But she did it by really, zigging where others were zagging. She was doing something that other people weren't. And I think that is an important lesson for us as we think through where we're going in our own leadership. Now, another story that I wanted to share with you guys is this fella. He is somebody I actually profiled in my most recent book, which is called Entrepreneurial You. And his name is Lenny Achon. And Lenny is somebody I got to know. I was consulting for Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And everybody was very pumped about Lenny. Everybody just kept being like, oh, have you met Lenny yet? Have you met him? What do you think of Lenny? And I was like, why is everybody talking about this guy? Like, what's his deal? And so eventually I found myself in a meeting with Lenny, and I discovered what his deal was. He had gotten a lot of buzz in his, in the company, in the organization. And it was because he was only 35 years old and he had become the chief communications officer. So it's a pretty fast rise. But the really interesting aspect about this, everybody was like, wow, this Lenny, he hadn't even come up through communications. He was a nurse. He was a nurse, and he had managed to become the chief communications officer. So when I finally had a chance to get to know him, I asked him, like, Lenny, how did you get here? Like, what was the deal? And he said, well, gosh, no one's ever asked me that before. I'm like, really? Well, okay, tell me, what's your answer? He said, well, I just pre-write my resume. And I said, Lenny, what does that mean? Like, I've never even heard of that. What are you talking about? And so I thought his answer was so interesting. I actually ended up writing a piece about it for the Harvard Business Review. If you want, you can Google it. You can find it for free. It's called A Campaign Strategy for Your Career. And basically what this entails, Lenny, pre-writing his resume, is that, most people, right? Most people keep a current resume. They may update it every year. Oh, well, okay, have I gotten a promotion? What are my new responsibilities? Let me type it in. That's great. That's fine. Lenny does something different. What Lenny does is that every year he updates his resume too, except his resume is written 5 years in the future. So right now, Lenny is writing his resume for 2025. And he will say in it, he's pretending it's 2025. He says what job he has in 2025, what he does for his job, like what are the tasks and responsibilities. And this is the most important part, what are the jobs that he will have had in between now and then? Because, anybody can have like a vision board, right? Like, oh, in 5 years, I'm going to be a billionaire. In 5 years, I'm going to be the president, or, whatever. Like, okay, you're just making things up. That's not really real, right? We're not talking about The Secret. What we're talking about with Lenny is we're talking about a guy who is identifying where he wants to go, and by working backwards, what are the skills that he needs to obtain so that he's ready for that job? What are the connections that he needs to make? What does he need to get on his resume now so that he can prepare himself for the next phase? That's what we're talking about. So you might, for instance, consider the idea of pre-writing your own resume. Now, here's another one I wanted to share. This is a woman I also wrote about in my books. Her name is Hank Philippi Ryan. And I got to know Hank when I was living in Boston. She is a well-known Boston newscaster. She has won 1 million Emmy Awards, local Emmy Awards for her investigative reporting. And she is, very well known in town for that. But the way that I got to know her actually was that I signed up for a writing workshop and she was in it. She was taking it. And so we got to be friends. And I was asking her about how she came to do this. And it was interesting. It turned out that there was a young woman who had actually started, who was working at the TV station. This young woman started as Hank's intern. She was 25, 30 years younger than Hank. And this young woman was actually, it turns out, working on a book. And she and Hank got to be close. And she said to Hank one day, hey, you know, I'm working on my book. I'm really trying to, you know, get it edited, get it spiffed up so that maybe I can get it published. Would you be willing to read it and offer some feedback? And Hank said, oh yeah, I'm happy to do that. So she took it home over the weekend. She's going to read this book. And when I interviewed Hank for my book, she told me, she said, Dorie, it's like that Zen saying, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Because in the process of reading her mentee's book, you know, her little intern's book, she had a revelation, which is that she had always wanted to write a book. The whole reason she had become an investigative reporter was that she loved mystery novels so much. You know, Agatha Christie and, you know, all the Nancy Drew, she loved it. But she had somehow never really thought it was possible for her to write a book. She never really thought that it was a real thing. But then she sees this young woman actually doing it. And she said, oh my God, I could do that. And so that is what brought her to the writing workshop. And in fact, since then, she's published more than half a dozen mystery novels. This is one of them right here. She's won a lot of awards in the mystery genre, and she's built a second career for herself as a mystery writer. And so the lesson here, I think that a lot of the conversation sometimes about mentorship in the corporate world, I feel like it's a little off. You know, because everybody's like, well, get a mentor. And, you know, that's not wrong. I mean, it's a great thing to have a mentor, but the problem is that it's a very narrow definition, right? Oftentimes the mentor is like, oh, well, it's, you know, this person who's like 20 years older than you and they're powerful and they take you under their wing. And it's like, you know what? We'd all like to be rescued. Yes, that would be nice. But you know what? Like that just doesn't really happen that often. Props to you if it does. But for most of us, that is not a real thing. That is just like a fantasy where the prince marries us or something. What is a lot more plausible though, and what I encourage people to do instead, is to actually think about creating what I call a mentor board of directors. So it's not just like looking for this one perfect senior person that, oh, they're everything I want to be in the world. You know, that's like a unicorn, right? What is a lot more reasonable for all of us can do this, is to create a mentor board of directors where there are multiple people. It could be 3 people, 5 people, 8 people, whatever it is, who exemplify aspects of what you want to learn or aspects of what you want to be. Maybe it's that this one is an amazing public speaker. Maybe this one seems to really have figured work-life balance out. Maybe this one is like so beloved by his employees and, you know, he's just like a great manager. And you say to yourself, I would like to learn to be more like that. I would like to learn from that person. And they could be senior people. They could be peers. They could even, like Hank, it could be someone younger than you. But it's sort of a more reasonable way to think about it. But it helps us broaden our skills because we don't have to learn everything on our own. We don't have to invent everything on our own. We can learn from other people and get the benefits of mentorship without just sort of waiting around to be chosen somehow. And so number 4, this kind of ties in with the previous point. It is bonding and bridging, right? I hope you like my bridge, my dramatic bridge graphic. So the bonding and bridging, you guys may potentially be familiar with these terms. They are terms from sociology, and they are especially talked about by a gentleman named Robert Putnam, who is a sociologist, an eminent sociologist. And he talks about networks and what makes for strong networks. And it turns out that there's basically 2 types of relationships. There's what is known as bonding capital and what is known as bridging capital. And the problem that most professionals have is that they are overweight in one part of their portfolio. most of us, if we have not really taken a lot of time and care, are going to be very overweight in bonding capital. And bonding capital, perhaps not surprisingly, it's relationships with people who are very similar to ourselves, right? It's easy. It's very easy to form relationships with people that you seem to have a lot in common with. That's just kind of human nature. However, there are certainly advantages to that. It's easy, it's fun, it's gratifying, but think of it like a stock portfolio, right? If all you do is invest in, sort of like, whatever, this kind of S&P 500 stocks, then that, if that's on a roll in the market, you're doing great. But if for some reason it turns out that's not so great, you run into trouble because everything you've invested is sort of in that one basket, and that one basket is tanking. And so we get situations now where, for instance, let's say you worked in the hospitality industry and all your friends, all your connections are in the hospitality industry. There's no one to help you right now. And it's not just hospitality, it's travel, it's entertainment, there's industry issues. Let's take a sort of narrower example. Let's say that you worked at a particular company and all your friends, all your connections worked at that company. Well, what if that company was Borders Books and then it went away? What if it was Circuit City? What if it, even now there's things, left and right that are going bankrupt. Brooks Brothers, Le Pain Quotidien, what is it? Is it J. Crew? Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, maybe someone will acquire them somewhere, but it is not looking great. And if all of your connections are there, it puts you in a structurally tenuous position. So what we need to do, and we need to make a real effort to do it, is to also cultivate bridging capital, which is relationships with people that are not so easy. Relationships with people that are a little different from us, people who, and they can be different in different ways, right? People who work in different industries, people who work in different cities, people who might be older than you or younger than you, people who are from different gender or different ethnic backgrounds. There's a lot of ways of thinking about this, but the more diversity you have in your network, it gives it resiliency. And I think that what we have seen during a time like this pandemic is that very unexpected things can happen. And it's not a bad thing to build resiliency in to almost anything we have, whether it's a network, whether it's a supply chain, because if you can't predict the future, you at least need to put yourself in a position to mitigate disaster. So this is one way of doing it, is really being conscious about building and maintaining relationships. So the fifth thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about, and I've made a point of throwing this in amidst the pandemic. I know you guys are working hard, doing something productive by pursuing your MBA right now. But I imagine that possibly some of you may have been working and have lost a job or taken some kind of a hit previously with regard to some of the things that are going on. Certainly, I'm sure you probably know friends and colleagues that have been affected by this. And so I wanted to just tell a quick story about a guy that I know in hopes that it might be useful. I'm actually working on a book right now this summer, which is going to be coming out next fall from Harvard Business Review Press. And I'm going to be writing about this guy's story. But his name is TJ. And I got to know TJ because for the past 7 years now, believe it or not, I have been working with Deloitte. They have a kind of corporate social responsibility program that they've been running for military veterans that are transitioning back into civilian life. And so about 4 times a year for the past 7 years, you can do the math, lots of times, I have gone to Dallas to their headquarters, their training headquarters, Deloitte University, and done a program for them where I talk about professional reinvention for military veterans. And so TJ was someone that I met during that program. And TJ came up to me. I was doing a book signing, and he came up to me and he's like, I had a question for you. And I'm like, okay. And he said, I know what I want to do. I'm just not sure it's a good idea. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds promising. Now you got to tell me. So TJ, the part that he knew he wanted to do that he felt like was probably a good decision for himself was he was going to go to business school. So TJ, like you, he's a business school grad. So, thumbs up on that. The part that he was a little less sure about was that there was a 9-month period in between his separation from the service and when business school would be starting the next fall. And so what he wanted to do was he wanted to travel to Malaysia and Singapore to attend yachting academies so that he could get his captain's license. He was in the Army, not the Navy, so he did not already have this. This was a new hobby for himself. And his big dream was that he wanted to be the skipper of a yacht during Yacht Week in Greece and Croatia during the summer, because he just thought this sounded like pretty much the most fun thing ever. And so he was like, is this terrible? Like, am I going to look really flaky? Like, should I just get an internship and, do a respectable thing? And, fortunately for the sake of our story, I told him, no, don't do that, TJ. I said, one of the most important things that we can do, frankly, to set ourselves apart, to build an interesting brand, is to make ourselves interesting, to other people. Because if you have the same resume as other people, if you just are, it's like a kind of cookie cutter thing, if there's nothing distinctive, I mean, you might be a nice person, you might be a great person, you might be a competent person, that is all good. But if you look like someone that is pursuing your dreams, and frankly, especially if you're pursuing dreams that a lot of other people are scared to pursue, they are going to want to talk to you about it. It is going to make you an object of interest. People are going to be fascinated by you, and it will give you a leg up. And so TJ went ahead, he got his skipper's license. He did do Yacht Week. It was fantastic. And he made use of it too. This was not just a one-off kind of thing. He actually, he went to a business school in Europe. Not exactly sure if Texas A&M also has this. Maybe you do, and I just don't know about it. But he went to a business school in Europe where apparently, who knew, they have sailing clubs. And so he was the president of the sailing club at his business school. And so he used it as a networking tool, because he was able to meet all of the alumni that had been part of the sailing club. And they, again, sailing, like, who knew, right? This is not my world. But they did these pan business school regattas during the year. And so he got to network with all these other people in business schools. Like, this was like the best thing for his networking in his business career, was doing this crazy thing. So I think sometimes we feel like, oh man, there's so much pressure. You got to keep going. Like, oh, you can't have a gap in your resume. But Frank, these are weird times. Okay. These are just weird times right now. So if you have something you've been wanting to do, this might be a good time to do it. Just something to think about. And the last thing, guys, that I wanted to talk to you guys about before we go into your thoughts, your questions, etc. So please feel free to get them ready. Type anything into the chat box if you have stuff that's on your mind. But the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about, this is actually a story that I tell. I'll give you another prop since we're at my desk. This is from my book, Stand Out, my second book. I write about this guy. His name is Tony Chan, and Tony is a venture capitalist. And a few years ago, he wrote a book called Hearts, Smarts, Guts, and Luck. And it was a wide-ranging analysis. He did literally like 3,000 interviews with successful executives and entrepreneurs to try to understand what made people tick, what made the most successful leaders, who they were. And what he discovered is that there was a substantial proportion, it was actually about 25% of people that in his taxonomy, he described as so-called luck-driven leaders. Now, this is kind of an interesting concept, right? What does it mean to be a luck-driven leader? I mean, luck is that thing you can't control, right? So what does that even mean? But it's interesting. It turns out there has been a lot of research done, in particular by a gentleman named Richard Weissman, a psychologist named Richard Weissman, about the concept of what makes people lucky. And while it is true, for sure, that we can't like control luck. We can't sort of predict it. Like, oh yes, I think I'm going to win the lottery today, so let me go play my numbers, right? We can't do that. But it turns out that there are upstream situations, there are upstream things that you can do and that you can control that make it more likely that you will experience the results of luck downstream, which is kind of interesting. And what Tony wrote about and what he discovered in his analysis of successful leaders was that luck-driven leaders disproportionately exhibited a couple of key characteristics that, it turns out, good news, we all can control, we all can do more of. And those characteristics were curiosity and humility. Because it turns out if you are curious enough about other people to be asking questions, to question situations, to say, well, why is it done this way? Or, oh, tell me about you, or what's your background? You will discover things and learn things that other people who are a lot more sure of themselves and feel like, oh, I don't need to talk to her, they're never going to find that out. And if we are humble enough to actually take in that information and that knowledge and realize that other people have something to teach us, then that actually enables us to take action. And it's in taking action that oftentimes we can become pretty darn lucky. So it's useful for all of us to think through, how can we be a little more curious, a little more humble? And so I'm eager to hear your thoughts, your experiences, your questions. The question for you, I've laid out, a bunch of different things, 6 different questions, ways of thinking, possibilities. I'm curious if any of them has resonated for you. Certainly, we're busy people. It's not like we have to do everything, but even if there is one thing that you can do or tweak, turn the dial on a little bit, it can make a big difference sometimes in our experiences. And so I will just mention too, if you guys are interested in sort of diving into these questions about your own brand as a leader, if you want to really think that through, I have a 42-page self-assessment, which is available for free. It is a series of questions. It's like a workbook. You can write your own answers in. And so if you are interested in being kind of walked through that process, please feel free to sign up to get that. You can go to dorieclark.com/join, JOIN, and you can get your standout self-assessment. So with that, why don't I zoom back here? I will stop the screen share. And Richard, let me go ahead and hand it back to you, and you maybe have some comments or some questions or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. Dorie, thank you so much. That was brilliant. I mean, spot on what I was expecting from you. There are a few questions, but I did want to just mention one quick thing because, you talk about bonding and bridging, and I could not agree with you more. The importance of diversifying your network. I actually believe it will also result in number 6, which is getting luckier. Certainly I would put that in there with humility and curiosity. The broader your network is, and so forth, things are gonna sometimes happen as a result of that. I think a lot of times, like if I, obviously I'm always trying to get my students involved in these different speaker events, lunch and learns, things like that. And it's always that question of, well, they got busy schedules, what's in it for them, right? But it's exactly these kinds of moments, Dorie, that I think, it's getting those little, pieces, those nuggets from speakers. It's also asking those kinds of questions that you kind of alluded to that lead to something, if not immediately, down the road. And that was certainly one of my major takeaways from your 6 points. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's get to some of the questions. Ryan Murphy has a great question, and it kind of is, it's a great segue from where I was going. She said, any tips on how to start bridging out our network?
Excellent. Thanks, Ryan. And nice to meet you. You have a lucky name too, since you're like, you and the Netflix showrunner. You're like, it's a power name right there. Everybody's going to take Ryan Murphy's call. So that's great. How do you begin to bridge your network? So the good news, right, is pretty much most people, or at least many people, right? It's not entirely one thing or another in terms of bonding and bridging, right? It's actually more like a Venn diagram. If you can picture, the from junior high math, right? The two circles that are on top of each other and they overlap in a certain place. And so it's useful to think through, what is it that I have in common with somebody that, that's like the bonding capital part, but I can also sort of bridge over, right? Because the goal is, you want to have as much diversity in the network as possible. But obviously, if there's somebody that like literally you have nothing in common with, that's a bit of a challenge. So for instance, something that you could do that's pretty easy is to start to get involved in Texas A&M activities, like go to alumni events or things like that, events where they're bringing alumni together. And you are going to have plenty in common because you can talk about your experience and, or you can do this with your undergrad, wherever you went for that. And you have that as like your bonding capital. But if you have done an analysis and you're like, gosh, I used to work in finance and like pretty much everyone I know is in finance, maybe you can use the Aggie connection to move to sort of spread out and be like, okay, well, who's a fellow alum that's a filmmaker or a comedian or who works in the tech industry or who works in real estate? And you can use that as a leverage point. And eventually, if you're doing things right, you'll actually form real friendships with those people. And through them, you'll meet their friends and it can become kind of concentric circles. So at that point, you might meet a secondary person that, you don't really initially have a lot in common with, but, they're good friends with Ryan. So you have that in common. And so you're able to, keep moving out. So it's like thinking through how to leverage your bonding to get to your bridging, if that makes sense.
Excellent. So that was one of our full-time MBA students. One of our MS business students, Aliyah, she says, thank you for your insights and stories, Dorie. I was curious how you find inspiration when writing and what the process looks like as you work to develop a profile for an individual, a leader.
Nice. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. So how do I find inspiration when writing? Well, so there's a few different ways to answer that. Part of it, so I am working on my book this summer, as I mentioned. It's kind of my COVID project. So I was working on it today, just before we got on. I think I wrote about 1,000 words today. So making progress. But part of how I make how do I sort of move that forward? I think inspiration is an interesting word, actually, because I used to be a journalist. And one of the advantages that I think journalists have is that writer's block is not allowed in journalism. I think that a lot of times, and I do executive coaching, I work with a lot of people, so you kind of hear like what the hangups are. And there's a lot of people that are like, oh, well, I could never write a book. I could never share my articles or whatever. And it's like, they feel like if they can't be like Tolstoy immediately out of the gate, then just like, oh, well, I could never do it. I could never, and of course, we know intellectually, no one is Tolstoy out of the gate. You have to practice and you have to get better, but you are never going to get there if you don't put in your reps. And so journalism is useful because you never have the luxury of being precious about anything, because it's like, what? You have a deadline. And, as long as it's not libelous, it's done. So that's pretty much the standard. Is like, is it good enough? Okay. So I am just focused right now on writing, Anne Lamott famously said, the shitty first draft, like just get it out, write your stuff. And so I kind of muscle through is the answer. In terms of how I find topics, oftentimes I will kind of collect questions that people ask, like in things like this, or, you know, if I'm giving a speech or something like that, I'll be like, oh, that's an interesting question. And so if I haven't written about it before, I will actually write it down in a file that I keep, and I'll be like, oh, okay, maybe I'll return to that later.
Excellent. Well, I see a couple of good questions in the chat. So Daniel, one of our MBAs as well, how do you go about finding this mentor board of directors figures, or the people who can really help us along and be able to teach us? A little bit of that luck you're talking about.
So certainly if you get amazing mentors, then that is a lucky thing. But actually, in some ways, what I'm advocating is sort of the opposite, in the sense that the lucky thing would be if, like, oh my gosh, just one day I like ran into Tim Cook at Whole Foods and he was like, let me give you everything. Would you like to be an SVP? Like, like, okay, you can dream. But what I like better is things that you can control, because I believe in agency. And so the things that we can control is taking the people who are already in our lives or already in our orbits in one way or another, and just, really sort of breaking down, like, well, I mean, so part of it's an analysis of like what you want to do better, right? Like, where do I want to expand, or how do I want to grow? Or just from looking at the people around you, just saying, if there's something that they do that you're just like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Those are the things that you can say, okay, you know what? I don't necessarily want to be like that person in every facet of their life, but I really admire how he does that. And so he can be my mentor for that. And I think it kind of takes the pressure off. The other thing to clarify is that sometimes people are just like, oh my gosh, well, I don't know what to say or how to get them to be my mentor. Here is my advice. Don't say anything. It is sort of a freaky thing a little bit, especially if you don't know the people that well, to be like, will you be my mentor? Like, it sort of sounds like, the person is busy, right? If they're anybody sort of, if they're like worth, having as a mentor, they're probably very busy. And so the idea of like, oh my God, what does this person want from me? They want to like talk on the phone for 7 hours a week? No, it's a little scary. And so it is better actually to have them as your secret mentor. And just in your head, that they're your mentor. And so it's not about like nailing down a role, like, oh, can I give you my letter sweater? It's not like that, right? What we want to do, we know that there are mentors. All you want to do is just have opportunities to interact with them. So that's the part that you want to control, is like to ask them, hey, Richard, thanks so much for the advice you gave me about blah, blah, blah. If I ever had a question, like a quick question as a follow-up, is it okay if I get back in touch with you about that? Like, that sounds manageable. Richard will probably say, sure, Dorie, that's fine. And then it's an excuse to keep in touch. Or you can be thinking, if it's someone that you actually are already closer to, you can be, saying like, oh, well, maybe I'll make a point of inviting them to coffee once a month, or, oh, I have an extra pair of tickets to this event, maybe I'll invite them to this event with me. And there's ways that you can do that, but you don't necessarily have to like declare a mentor relationship in order to have one.
That is really such a great point, because we have those kinds of relationships with even sometimes our supervisors, the people that we interact with a lot, top people within an organization, we look up to them. I mean, just by, sort of aspiring to have those kinds of values that they have and things like that, they really can be a mentor to us without any, as you said, any sort of formal, hey, you're my mentor. I think that's really a great point. Nathaniel Fernandez says, thank you for all your insights. What are your thoughts on dealing with setbacks? Yes, thank you. So yeah, there's lots of people that have probably experienced some setbacks, especially in recent months. I mean, people always experience setbacks, but you just think about like societally writ large, like all the college sophomores that like, or the college freshmen that like, oh yay, I've gone off to college now, I'm a mature adult, and then it's like,
and I'm moving back into my old bedroom. Like that's a setback. There's just all kinds of things that we were counting on that are not necessarily happening right now. But I think in general, the thing that I would say, first of all, actually, the mentor board of directors can be quite powerful here, because it's easy to kind of get in our own heads sometimes, or get in a spiral. And so having outside judgment can be very useful to prevent us from just making cognitive errors. We might be like, oh, this definitely means that. And the truth is, it might mean that, or it might not. And so it is really useful to have a group of people that you respect and trust, where you can say, hey, what do you think this means? And they might actually say, oh, well, it probably means this other thing. You could be like, oh, right, maybe it does. So having that is very useful. I think the other thing is just, when it comes to setbacks, is finding another productive thing to be doing, right? It is important as humans for all of us to feel like we are making progress in some way. And so if we thought we had this bird in hand and all of a sudden it's been kind of taken from us, of course that's going to be upsetting, right? That's natural. But if we're just sitting there for like 5 months being like, I can't believe that didn't work out, like before long, you're going to be a very bitter person. And so you need to find another thing to do. Like, I don't know what, like, just like whatever your goal was, odds are the way you were going to do it is probably not the only way that you could have done it. Maybe you had like, some entry-level job at William Morris or something, and you were going to go into Hollywood. Well, and now it's been rescinded. That is terrible. That would be awful. But you know what? Okay, if you're like back at home, you can start a YouTube channel now. And who knows, maybe it'll be better. Maybe it's actually better. Instead of working your way up as an agent, maybe you're going to create your own content and have that discovered. Maybe you can start writing articles. Maybe you can start writing a book. Maybe you can be just going all in on Zoom networking, whatever it is, there's probably something you can do. And so I think the best way to deal with setbacks is to control the things that you can control.
That's great. Craig, another one of our first-year MBAs, thank you for the great presentation. A lot of us will soon begin to apply and interview for internships and full-time roles. What is an effective way to make a great first impression, especially over Zoom, virtual networking, and interviews? That's a good question.
Totally, Craig. Totally. My first advice, always the best first impression comes from wearing a hoodie, like I am. I feel like COVID dress codes are just, the other day I was in this coffee shop that I've been going to since the pandemic, and the barista got all excited. He's like, "Whoa, pressed shirt!" I'm like, "Yeah, that's right." So yeah, I think it's probably still a good idea to dress up for the Zoom interview. But I think that ultimately it's largely how it was before, right? I mean, the same principles apply in the sense that most people are very lazy and very unprepared. And so if you actually look like you have done a substantial amount of research about that company and that industry and are able to make intelligent comments and ask intelligent things, like, well, what about the competitive threat presented by blah, blah, blah? They'll be like, oh, you know about the competitive threat presented by blah, blah, blah? Wow. And you can have an actual real dialogue. So I think that still will get you very far. I think above and beyond that, it just the Zoom part is just being as comfortable and as natural as you possibly can. Like, I think that sometimes there's a tendency in interviews to have to, just very, very stiff. Yes, sir. And that might feel respectful, but the truth is, it's a little weird. Like, it's a little weird in person, and it's especially weird on Zoom to be very stiff and formal, because it makes you look nervous, and people don't want nervous employees. They want confident employees. And so the more you can actually just go into the headspace of like, hey, I'm having a call with a friend. great. Tell me about you. You want to be exuding the vibe of like, you have nothing to lose. You're just, hey, let's make a friend. That is definitely the best headspace to be in. And above and beyond that, of course, I mean, don't do, this, obviously, you've been spending 4 months on Zoom, but like, weird things like, oh, I'll just, whatever. I have too many lights, so it doesn't even work. I was going to try to turn myself black against the window, but I've outsmarted it because I have like 75 lights in my house now. So the lighting is always good, but you don't want like these ghost things where it's like, oh, it's the witness protection Zoom. But I'm sure that you already have figured that out.
That's true. I mean, having that professional, obviously, appearance and everything is clearly important, especially when you're doing it virtually. Dr. Arvind Mahajan, the Associate Dean for the graduate programs, has a question for you. So I'm going to let him unmute and ask directly. Arvind, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Richard. And thank you, Ms. Clark, for your wonderful, inspiring presentation. I think this is very valuable for our students. One thing I felt in building a brand, an individual brand, at the core of that brand, from my perspective, is developing certain traits and skills, like one competence for which students join our program. Hard work, striving for excellence, being reliable, delivering on time, integrity, innovativeness, etc. It seems to me that those are the core values of developing a brand. And if you don't have those, you cannot put a lipstick on a pig and call it something else. So it seems to me, as I reflect in building a brand, you need to have those fundamental core values, and you have to deliver on them with no exceptions every time, and a natural brand emerges, which you can then accentuate with the steps you have provided in providing direction and focus. But absent those core skills, you will not go very far, it seems.
Yeah, Arvind, thank you very much for being here and for sharing that. Certainly, I think that's really true. I mean, I think part of why sometimes in the discourse, people think about personal branding and feel like it's maybe this kind of shallow thing is they think, whoa, who has a personal brand? Well, the Kardashians have personal brands, and they think, oh, well, that's just all there is to it, is like the brand is how many Instagram followers you have, which of course is not accurate. Your brand is, what do you stand for? What does that really look like? And I think a key part of what you mentioned that is really critical is it's not really so much what you say about yourself as what you are doing, because your brand is different than an elevator pitch. Sometimes people conflate that too. It's not, because if somebody came into an interview, oh, well, so, tell me about you. Well, I am a hard worker with lots of integrity. Then, anybody can say that, right? Everybody does. It's not distinctive. It's not. It's not anything useful, because literally a criminal could walk in the room and say that about themselves, and unless you have detailed knowledge about that person, it's hard to disprove it. So what we want to really be thinking about, first of all, is the question between the difference of seeming versus being. How do we live out our values? In Reinventing You, in fact, the latter third of the book is a section that I called "Live Out Your Brand," about how to make sure that you are evincing it in everything that you do. And I think the other piece that's interesting to me is to think in terms of examples, because lots of people might say, oh yes, well I'm very this or I'm very that. what I like and where I feel like a brand, whether it is a corporate brand or a personal brand, where it really can shine and gain traction is in what I will call extreme examples. And so if you want something to be a part of your brand, or you believe it strongly enough to be a brand, think about what is an extreme example. There was always, there's sort of a saying, which is probably an apocryphal saying, frankly, about Nordstrom's, the retailer, that, oh, they had the most amazing customer service, right? And so the story that circulated was that somebody like a year later returned tires to Nordstrom, and it was like, well, I want a refund, because of these tires, blah, blah, blah. And Nordstrom was like, oh, well, since like a year later, and they're like, oh, certainly, sir, here, let us help you. And the punchline is that Nordstrom didn't sell tires, that they were like so giving to their customers that, and there's the example that they would even do that. But so just let me give you a personal example in terms of a personal brand. So you can say, well, I'm someone that follows through on my commitments, okay? But I will give you an example from my own life. I was dating someone once, and we broke up, and it was like not a nice breakup. It was like a, rancorous breakup. But before we broke up, I had promised that I would give her a chair that I had. There was this one particular chair, and I promised that I would give it to her. And so even after the breakup, I drove 45 minutes each way and hand delivered her the chair because I had promised the chair. And so that's like the extreme example, right? So if you think in your own life, okay, well, what's your extreme example? You can say I'm reliable or I'm this or I'm that, but if you have stories like that, that's the proof, that's the evidence. So I appreciate you mentioning that, Arvind. That's a great point.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, bottom line is you're really, I mean, what they say about your personal brand is what's right, what people's going to say about you when they, when you leave the room, right? I mean, that's, really in a sense your personal brand. I know there's there's like a handful of questions still remaining, but I want to be very, I want to be very sensitive to Dorie's time. We agreed from 1 to 2. I'd like, ideally, if you could at least, Dorie, to maybe share just some final thoughts with us all.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you, friends, for taking an hour out of your day and your sort of busy orientation period to get to spend time together. I think it's great that that folks are convening for this. Overall, when it comes to building your personal brand, what I've come to realize, actually, I've done a lot of subsequent research, especially in my book, Stand Out. I talk a lot about this, about, what does it take to become known as an expert in your company or in your field? And what I've come to realize is that there's really 3 components to that. One is content creation, because you need to somehow share your ideas. It doesn't mean you literally have to write things, although you can, that's a great way, but it means you have to share your ideas so that other people know what they are. Maybe it's just lunch and learns or things like that. Another is social proof. What can you do to demonstrate that you're credible? So while you're at Texas A&M, can you become the president of a club? Can you get involved in university activities? Can you start writing for a university publication, or do an internship with a company that people have heard of? All of those things are things that provide social proof. And then the third component, the last component, is your network, because whatever you do, it's nice, but if you're living in a cave, it's not going to travel very far. And so you need it to be amplified. And the people who can amplify it are the people in your network. So especially taking the time to invest in building relationships with your colleagues is very, very powerful, both now and in the future as you enter your professional lives. So I am cheering you on and wishing you great luck. Again, if you're interested, I'll type it into the chat box in getting the self-assessment, the personal brand self-assessment. You can get it at dorieclark.com/join, and that's a free self-assessment there. And I am really glad to see all of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dorie. We really, really appreciate it. What better way to spend our Friday than, having an hour with you? It was awesome. Also, I will also recommend, the post that I had done leading up to this event. There were a lot of people from all over chiming in and talking about how Dorie's LinkedIn learning sessions are phenomenal. So, if you get a chance to join one of those sessions too, I would highly recommend. Dorie, thank you so much for spending an hour with Mays Business School, Texas A&M today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
I'll be in touch. I owe you one. Thanks y'all for participating.
Lunch is ready.